Yeah, hi. I'm Ed Lee, co-founder and CTO at Applatix, where we're helping our customers migrate to the cloud using container-based applications. In developing our product and technology, to do this, we've learned a lot about AWS and using containers and automation in order to optimize costs. So we just wanted to share those learnings with you today.
Hi everyone, I'm Mukulika, the product director of Applatix, and as Ed said, that a lot of things that we will be talking about today is based on our learnings over last couple of months here. So with that, let's start. So customers start with, say, migrating one application to the cloud or building the first service on the cloud. And very soon, because moving to the cloud is easier than building applications on-premise, they start growing more and more services on the cloud. And when that happens, very often there's a huge risk of meeting one of these cloud disasters. The first one being the financial one. As soon as the services grow in the cloud, the expense seems to be growing exponentially.
Since one of the big advantages of cloud is allowing kind of developers to self-service their needs, it's very easy to kind of get in a situation where you keep spinning up new resources. And of course, developers are not always the easiest crowd to get to pay attention to the bottom line. So.
Similar issues happen when operations team are trying to manage the applications in the cloud. The learning is very different when you're managing applications on-prem versus in the cloud, leading to SLA breaches. And then there are other business risks, like the reason you move to the cloud is to get better business agility, and sometimes you see that no, because of learning issues, you're not moving as fast. And lastly, there can be different security issues, especially around open ports and vulnerability assessments.
Yes, I think I'd like to call it AWS anxiety, but it's the thought of waking up in the morning and maybe finding that something went wrong. Yeah.
Okay, so most customers follow some kind of a cloud management framework, which starts with monitoring and then analyzing, optimizing, and then applying some governance or control. And customers do it around 3 dimensions. It starts with account management for the public cloud, then they look at the cost, and then they look at resource utilization. And automation is key to analyzing and optimizing, right, Ed?
Yes, definitely. It's very hard to, as your cloud grows particularly, very hard to get a handle on it without appropriate automation.
Okay, so we already talked about it, how to bring order to the chaos. So the first thing you need to do is provide visibility across all your clouds and across all your cloud accounts. Even like today in our company, we use multiple cloud accounts based on different groups, products. And then the second thing is we need to tag every resource, right?
Yes, tagging is a kind of a advanced technique. And it's something that you could start out very easily and just become more sophisticated over time, but it's really hard to get a good understanding of how you're using resources without tagging. And tagging, as we'll see, can be used for a lot more than just cost allocation.
Okay, so once you start gathering the data and provide visibility, you need to make sure you're tracking both operational and financial metrics, because your different users need different kinds of data, and then you need to make sure you're analyzing the trends and detecting anomalies, like why suddenly one fine day it is going up.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we will start in today's webinar first with the basics of cost and usage monitoring and analysis, which you have to do, but that is more reactive. You learn as you go and you apply it as a process. But in the second half, we'll go to more advanced topic around containers and automation, which is more a proactive approach, which you need to start thinking from day one.
Yeah, and that's the
fun
area.
part.
That's exactly the part that I'm particularly excited about.
That's why it's in orange. So
I'm wearing orange today. So.
So we will start first with the quick wins, which is the basics of cost and usage, visibility, and analysis. So you want to talk a little bit, Ed, about how we should standardize our accounts?
Yeah, so of course, when you're first starting out, you probably just start with one account. You're doing some experimentation. But very quickly, as you start getting additional groups and projects, you find that it's really convenient to be able to create kind of sub-accounts or additional accounts in order to provide isolation as well as kind of better kind of billing visibility and accountability. Each account can have its own limits, and which is both useful for restricting particular projects as well as kind of understanding how cost and spending occurs in those things. So one of the first things you probably want to do, even as you're starting out, is just think a little bit about, based on your organizational structure, how projects are organized, how you want to structure these accounts. Like you may want to create an account per department, maybe per project, and then within the project, what are the kind of the use cases you may have, that you might want to use tagging in order to get kind of visibility, within the accounts.
Okay. But everything can't be done by account divisions, and that's where tags come into picture.
Yes, and tags really have multiple purposes. A lot of people, of course, use them for cost allocation purposes to know, who's using this resource, what project is using this resource. But you can also use them to annotate, what is this resource being used for, so that when a month later you see that some resource is still provisioned, you think that maybe it was being used for testing, you think that the testing should be finished by now, it's useful to tag that. And then one of the things I like to do is to add kind of an expiration time to all of the major resources, so that and also, of course, as users allocate resources, have them add these as well, so that when as resources pass their expiration time, you can easily kind of follow up on them. It just provides a lot of useful information at a glance.
Okay, so we see a lot of customers tag based on projects and owners and also environments, but expiration tagging is interesting. So sometimes people tag to group and resources under an account, but sometimes people tag to roll up the data across accounts, right? So
Yes.
It can be used in both ways.
Yes, exactly. And one of the useful things about tags is that if you use them consistently, they can span accounts as well, so it provides visibility across accounts.
Okay. So we already talked about some of the example tags. It can be name of the person who created the resource, projects.
Right. Yeah, and these are just some examples of tags you may consider for your own use. And note that some tags like backup or other types of tags could be used for automation or operational purposes. And now a couple of things to keep in mind. If you are using tags for cost allocation purposes, then you do have to explicitly enable them to be output in your billing reports. Otherwise, you won't see them. So the other thing also that's very useful is that you can actually create IAM policies that are conditioned on tags. So that provides you with additional options in terms of securing your infrastructure.
That means you need to be pretty disciplined about tagging and need to automate it.
Yes. I mean, consistency is very important in effectively using tagging.
Okay. So under cost management, we talk about account management and tagging. So next let's go to some billing reports. AWS does provide a lot of reports.
Yes. Interestingly enough, billing reports are not enabled by default. Although you could use the console and through the Cost Explorer to kind of interactively look at the reports. But this is probably something you should just do right from the beginning, because eventually you're going to want to analyze your spending.
Yes, and your tagging has to be done before you create all these reports, because you cannot go back and tag.
That's correct. If you just enable tagging, you're not going to retroactively get data for the past
usage.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So again, using your AWS Cost Explorer or report, once you generate those reports, you have to continuously analyze the trends, investigate.
Right, and these are just the basic steps. But the reason it's useful to analyze trends is that you really need to become familiar with your a kind of general pattern and past history of how you are spending resources, so that when something strange happens, you can very quickly identify that this is not normal. Of course, some things are very obvious, like you may see a sudden spike in spending or something like that. But other things are a lot more kind of gradual. You may see only a slight bump, but that, even though it's a small bump, that bump may persist for a long time. So if you don't look into it, then you may be wasting resources kind of slowly over a long time, which still adds up to a large value. And then, depending on your organization, you may need more process and structure, but generally speaking, I think there's no really good substitute for talking to your users and seeing, why are they using these resources? When will they be done? It's very common for people when they're using the cloud to spin up resources and just leave them running and forget to turn them down.
So if AWS Cost Explorer is free, is that enough? Do we get everything?
I think it's good enough for very basic analysis, but it has a lot of limitations in terms of really doing kind of more detailed cost analysis and optimization. So as a result, a lot of users use third-party applications, which do cost some money but provide much better visibility, as well as like helping you allocate the use of reserved instances and so forth. So other kind of more advanced cost allocation techniques.
Okay. Yeah, the first thing we faced issues is that Cost Explorer shows the data per account, and we needed to look at across accounts. And that's when we built our own tool called Claudia. So let's talk a little bit about Claudia without talking a lot about our company, but we wanted to show you why we built this product Claudia. It's available as a free AMI on AWS under EC2s, and you can launch it from there. And all you have to do is you have to feed your AWS cost and usage reports to Claudia.
Yeah, and this is a tool that we built mainly for our own use, because before this, we found that Cost Explorer wasn't really providing everything we needed. And so we were just running SQL queries manually, really, on the data that, the billing data that we dumped into an SQL database for analysis purposes. But that was kind of time consuming and, hard to do kind of, interactive analysis. So this is something we built. We found it sufficiently useful that we wanted to kind of provide it as a free application that others can use.
Okay. So using Claudia today, we view firstly all accounts in one centralized place, right? We can see the breakdown per account. We can see the usage per region. And then we can also see the usage per services. This is the most interesting part, where we see the usage per services, and then we can take one service and drill down into it.
Yeah, so a very common workflow would be, you would want to drill down into, say, something like EC2 usage. And when you pick a particular resource, you get additional group by options. So then you might want to group by one of the additional options, like instance pricing. So then you can see, how much of it is, on demand versus spot versus reserved. We have a little bit of reserved. Usually there's a little bit of reserved. But generally, we try to use spot instances because they are a lot more flexible.
And cheaper.
Yes.
And then another example can be, for example, you're looking at instance family, say the services, under services, you're looking at S3. You can look at the different operations under S3.
Yes.
And the buckets, the cost under each one of them.
Yes, and you can see that, generally speaking, for our particular use case, it's mostly capacity cost, the standard storage, but you could also see that in some cases, if we're running like heavy tests or something, this particular operation is spending, more money than others. And then if you're curious, like where or who is spending that money, then you can group by again, and you can see exactly like which account. So in this case, it's the the SV2 account. So this kind of process of where you filter and then group by filter, group by filter, group by interactively is a very common kind of simple workflow that we wanted to make very efficient.
And also, like when we want to look at how different teams are using our AWS resources, we use tags. We don't use regular filters. We use the more advanced resource tags and look at the different users and who created what. And with that, let's now go back to our slides. So we talked about cost management. Under cost management, we talked about account management. We talked about tagging. We talked about how to use AWS reports or your third-party tools. Now let's talk about resource management. Okay, so while you set up your accounts and cost management properly, you need to make sure you're monitoring your resources also properly. Again, AWS CloudWatch is one resource monitoring tool. We have similar third-party resource monitoring tools. AWS CloudWatch provides basic custom metrics, provides log monitoring, alarms. It's very important. Why is resource monitoring so important?
So of course building data is very useful, but building data is delayed. It really only gets updated, twice a day really. Whereas kind of the resource usage is kind of real-time data. It's a lot more, up to date. But more importantly, like building data doesn't really show you what the actual utilization of your resources are. It only tells you how much you're using, but what is the CPU or memory utilization of a particular instance? Have you sized it correctly, so on. So using kind of combining the building data as well as kind of the utilization data you get from CloudWatch allows you to do a much better job of kind of right-sizing your resources. And typically the resources you would want to right-size for most customers would be instances and EBS volumes.
Okay, so we got resource monitoring and we got cost monitoring. Now, shouldn't we map these two if we really want to see which are the underutilized, most expensive cost buckets?
Yes, ideally you would want to correlate this information.
Okay, and that's something that AWS tools doesn't provide, and you might have to use third-party tools to correlate both the cost and resource utilization data.
Yes, and of course a lot of people just write their own scripts too.
Okay, and another limitation can be that there is no application level monitoring or tracing which you require, especially when you're using microservices-based applications.
That's correct. Like you could have a large instance, maybe it's actually running multiple applications, or maybe you're using it to run a set of containers, and the AWS tools by default will not provide you any kind of granularity below an instance. So, yeah.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about reserved instance planning. There are two types of reserved instances, standard and convertible. So when should customers use which one?
Right, so reserved instances, it's a huge topic. There's a lot of things one has to be aware of to use them properly, but generally speaking, the most flexible ones are the convertible reserved instances. You could change instance types from M3 to M4, but the main drawback is that you need a three-year contract or term in order to use it. I think for a lot of people, the sweet spot may be kind of the 1 year partial upfront. The 1 year is not so long that you're worried about technology changing or your uses changing, and the partial upfront gives you a significant discount over no upfront, but the full upfront doesn't really give you that much of a discount. So partial upfront 1 year reserved instance is a nice trade-off. Another good thing about partial upfront, just from a kind of a billing process, is that since you do get charged over time for at least part of the usage or cost, it's a good reminder that you have these reserved instances. Really the important thing though is not so much the term of the contract, but the break-even point. So this kind of depends on the instance type, but most instances, if you're using the partial upfront 1 year RI, the break-even point is 7 months. Whereas for a 3-year RI, the break-even point would be 14 months. And so when you're trying to decide whether to use a reserved instance or not, you should really be thinking in terms of, will I be using this instance for 7 months? Because if you use it for at least 7 months, any use after that is basically free. So even if you don't use it 100% over the entire 1 year, it'll be better for you to use a reserved instances. So something, basically focus on kind of the break-even point rather than the term of the contract.
Okay, so partial upfront payment with 1 year reserved instance seems to be a sweet spot for most use cases. So we talked about standard reserved instance are bound to a particular instance family, and the convertible instance is not. Is there anything else that we should talk about?
Yeah, we won't go into a lot of detail on this stuff, but just a couple things to really keep in mind is recently Amazon changed the way they use reserved instances, so to give customers a lot more flexibility. So beginning last year, for example, it used to be that you had to pick the particular availability zone that you wanted the reserved instance to be in, but you no longer need to do that. If you specify that a reserved instance should really be bound more to a region than a zone, it means that it means that you don't really have to specify the zone. You automatically get the discount regardless of the zone you're using. But the trade-off for that is you'll no longer have a capacity reservation. So in some cases, you may have to wait a short time before you can spin up the reserve. And then just this month, Amazon made another change where you no longer need to specify the size of the reserved instance within a family. So you could basically say, I want M3 reserved instances. You don't have to say what size, and it will automatically apply the discount.
I think because of that change, people will use it more and more because now they're not restricted by size.
Yes.
So, okay. So we learned that the reason why you need to look at your resource monitoring, because you need to right size your resources. Otherwise, your whole point of moving to cloud to save cost doesn't help. We learned about the new regional reserved instance benefits. Now it's all based on a region and instance family, not size. Next, let's talk a little bit about automating our resources with policies. Like when should we turn off our resources? When should we delete some of the resources, and how can we automate it?
So one of the big benefits of obviously the public cloud is that it's pay as you go. So as soon as you stop or power off an instance, you don't no longer have to pay for it. So ideally in the public cloud, you would only be running your resources when you actually need it. But this is kind of hard to do manually. So to do this properly, you require some level of automation. And so if you are not really using automation to do this, then you are probably paying a lot more for your resources than you really need to.
Okay. And at the same time, we need to do what-if analysis to...
Yeah, I mean, the approach I would think of it is when you're trying to figure out whether you should use a reserved instances, you basically care about the marginal reserved instance, like does one additional reserved instance save you money or cost you money, and also taking into account kind of the fact that if you use a reserved instance, you lose some flexibility if your needs change. So what I'd like to do is to kind of ask two questions, based on like the past 3 months of usage, would a additional ROI have saved me money? And then also kind of based on the next 3 months of expected usage, does it justify getting another reserved instance?
Okay. And the final optimization is based on spot instances, but using spot instances is hard because it can die. But it gives the most...
bang for the buck, yes. It's the cheapest way to get instances. And for most customers, the bulk of the spending, or most users, the bulk of the spending will be in instances. So using the proper instance type is important. Spot instances in general, like if you leave them running 24/7, will typically be about 5x cheaper. If you use them primarily at night to burst like batch jobs, then it'll be up to like 10x cheaper. And even compared with reserved instances, they're 2 to 3 times cheaper. So if you can use them effectively, then they are a fantastic bargain. Unfortunately, they're very difficult to use unless you use some amount of automation. And in some cases, you may also have to modify your applications.
And we'll talk about that in more details towards the end, right? Yeah. So let's now go to the fun part, which is how can containers and automation help? And how can we proactively build our application so that we can make use of this? So, okay. So with automation, how can containers help is when we are moving, especially, let's go to this one. So when customers are migrating to the cloud, there are different ways of migration like rehosting, refactoring, re-architecting. But the first one is rehosting. Customers take the existing application and move it to the cloud, which they call lift and shift. So suppose it was running in one VM, they move it to one EC2 instance, right?
Yes, and that is an easy way to do it, or at least a good way to get started. But I think many people are surprised by the cost of doing that if they do it kind of blindly. Because kind of VMs running on premise really are somewhat different from instances running in AWS. For example, on premise you're running a lot of VMs on an EXX server, and a VM doesn't use, say, all of the, it's only using some of the resources. Those resources that it doesn't use are available to other VMs running on your EXX server. So it's not really wasted because one particular VM, is idle or something like that. Whereas in AWS, each instance is really more like a slice of a physical server. Each instance comes with it a fixed amount of memory and CPU, and anything you don't use is just wasted. You're just wasting your money. So when you're moving a VM to an instance in AWS, you're essentially de-virtualizing your infrastructure. You spent the past 5-10 years turning all your servers into VMs, and now you're turning them back into servers. So as a result, when you do the lift and shift, you have to carefully size the instances for each application to make sure that it's not using more resources than it's needed. And obviously that can be a time-consuming job.
It's a very different mind shift change because people, when they move to cloud, they really don't think of those instances as fixed instances. But then how do we make these cloud instances behave more like VMs so that we don't waste compute resources and get the kind of utilization, like 80% utilization like Facebook and Google does?
Yes, and obviously that is very attractive to a lot of people. If you could get the same 80% utilization, think about how much money you would save. But this is one of the things I really find very exciting about containers is that you basically need a new form of virtualization technology in the cloud, in the public cloud, in order to increase your efficiency or to use it more effectively. And I believe that containers is a really good virtualization technology for the cloud. It allows you to, of course, provide isolation in terms of environmental dependencies. It also makes it very easy to kind of stack multiple applications within a particular instance, that is, pack them. And also is very amenable to automation in terms of like restarting the containers or the other type of things. So by properly using containers and automation technology, you could get a much higher utilization.
Okay, so from VM 30-40% utilization, when you move to the cloud, you initially see with instances 20 to 30%.
If you do like a lift and shift. Yes.
Yeah, if you do like a lift and shift. Then when you use containers, it goes up above 60%. But using containers is new. It's new technologies. There's a big learning curve. So how can customers make use of containers to get this greater utilization at decreased cost?
Yes, I mean, most of them, if they're not going to invest a lot in terms of their own development, they will need help from, they'll have to use other tools and techniques. In particular, if we've decided to use containers in order to kind of make your cloud operations more agile and efficient, then you probably want to use some type of container orchestration system, because manually managing hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of containers is just not feasible.
Okay, so firstly, you're moving to the cloud. You're taking your VMs. You first try with EC2 instances. You don't see low utilization. Then you use containers within those EC2 instances. And now we are talking about spot instances on top of containers.
Yes, and one of the things that I really like about containers is that it makes it a lot easier to use spot instances. If you set up the right automation around it, you could take And of course, with spot instances, you could lose them at any time because you're kind of bidding for them on an hourly basis. But in practice, I found them to be fairly available. Like we routinely run applications as spot instances for a month or two at a time without any interruption. But occasionally there is a week where you may get interrupted every day. So it really depends on how other people are using spot instances. But overall, like if you structure your applications properly, you have and I would say that spot instances today are probably amenable for a fairly large fraction of the applications that currently run in AWS, if you just had the right tooling and processes in place to use them.
So firstly, people can use their dev test environment using spot instances?
Yes, that's absolutely a great use case, because most of like CI/CD type of workflows are basically batch jobs. You can run them whenever it's necessary. And also they can be restarted if they're interrupted.
But even within production use cases like batch processing of large amount of data.
Or even over many web servers or things like that, containers restart really quickly. So as long as the application can restart quickly and reliably, you can use spot instances. There's many advanced techniques you can use with spot instances to make sure they're more available. Like you can bid across multiple availability zones for spot instances. You can bid across multiple instance types. Generally speaking, I've never seen a case where spot instances aren't available across some zone or some similar instance type. But even if they are not, you can also automatically switch to on-demand instances for the periods when they're not available.
Okay, so basically you can use spot instances if your application can tolerate restart after termination, and containers make it faster to restart after termination, right?
Yes, those are the very general, basic guidelines. Yes.
But to get more details on how to build our application using containers and spot instances, we will have much more dedicated webinars following. But today we wanted to talk mainly about cost and the different ways of really reducing your cost, really do a good job of cost management. So we've started with account management, which is step 1 for any cloud management activity. Then we talked about billing and reporting and how to do data analysis. Then we talked about tagging of all your resources. Then we talked about why resource monitoring is important and why it should be correlated with cost management.
Yes, particularly the actual utilization of your resources.
Yes, and then we talked what all we need to automate, because you cannot use spot instances, for example, without automation.
Right. If you try to do that manually, you will drive yourself crazy,
yes,
and you will succumb to AWS anxiety. So.
Yes. And then we talked about the new regional reserved instance features, and and start using containers and automation to see how you can get benefits.
Yeah, I think a good starting point is there's definitely most people will probably eventually use containers at some point. So even if you are not ready to use them or you don't use them now, it's not a bad idea to start at least learning about them and investigating how you might use containers, what kind of applications you have would be amenable to running in containers.
Okay, and so for more resources, they can go to applatix.com, and to learn more about containers and how to automate and container orchestration. That's our next webinar.
We have more webinars and ebooks and such on applatix.com under the resources tab. We'll do another webinar on April 13th, and it will be about using Kubernetes on AWS. Again, it'll be kind of our battle scars from doing it ourselves and what our lessons were that we learned. And I have 3 questions here, if that's from folks, if we want to go into that right now. But so the first one is on like what kind of metrics can you get out of a container in general, and then how does that compare to a VM?
Okay. I would say like the basic metrics for containers and VMs are very similar. Like there's like CPU utilization, memory utilization, disk I/O networking, etc. But I would say that like the big difference is that with containers you get such like much more granular data. Like for particular application, workflow, or job, exactly how much that job or workflow actually used in terms of resources. Whereas for a VM, you only get it kind of at the instance level. So if you have multiple things running in the VM, you wouldn't see any kind of further visibility.
Cool. All right. The Claudia demo you showed, how can people, I don't know if we told people how they could get that exactly. Did
we can again show it so that all you have to do is go to AWS console, North Virginia region, and then under EC2, under community AMIs, because this is free and public, just search by Claudia and then you can launch it using IM3 large. And the product documentation actually tells how to feed the AWS reports into Claudia.
Okay. So it should set up pretty quick.
Yeah.
All right. And then you might have talked about this one already, but so you talked about reserved instances versus spot instances a lot, but did you hit on like what kind of workloads might be best for spot instances specifically?
So we gave some examples like dev test environments, CI/CD workflows, then even in production, like some of the batch processing.
Yes, I mean really, I would say that the majority of workloads are probably are fine to run on a spot instance with the right kind of automation around it, but where you would probably get the biggest savings is where you have lots of jobs to run. So things Mukul just mentioned, like batch processing, like CI/CD workflows, things like that. Or if you have a large collection of web servers, that you're load balancing across things.
You just have to keep in mind that if they terminate, how your application can restart. That is the most important thing, and that's what we will try to cover in all our next webinars, like how to do container orchestration.
Okay, well, great. Well, that is the questions, and that is, we're out of time, and thank you everybody for joining us. We are going to send you a video of, and a recording obviously, of the webcast today on Monday, and post the slides. And we hope you'll join us next time, and we really appreciate your time and attention, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.